Okay, welcome to Module 3. This is the first recording in Module 3, and I'm actually more excited this week than in previous weeks because we are now ready to start on our first of 3 main ethical theories. And as I have in the slide here, it is a theory based on consequences. So this is an introduction to consequentialism, and let's get started. So let's focus on the historical context. You watch the Van Norden video where he said the most important thing when you want to understand a philosopher, well, 2 important things actually. First is, what's a question that bothered this thinker? What question is their philosophy a response to, and why were they bothered with this question? Now, if you read the parts about J.S. Mill in the module or in the lessons, especially the parts taken from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you will know a bit about Mill's personal history already. But here I want to talk more about the overall historical context in which he was living, just to give you an idea about where or how he's coming from, where he's coming from. Okay. So first, Mill lived in 19th century England, where the socio-political landscape and the economic systems are being or were affected by the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, and actually what came with the Industrial Revolution, especially for England, England was a big empire even up to this point in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution created massive amounts of wealth, both via the machines, which were able to help people produce things like cotton, soap, buttons at a grand scale, and that earned a lot of people money. But a very few people earned a lot of money. Usually it's the people who had access to capital. But also the Industrial Revolution created a scenario or a society where there were no rules yet to deal with new arrangements where people were leaving the countryside and they were working in factory towns. There was no sanitation in factory towns. It's just a bunch of dwellings that happened to pop up in places like Manchester and Liverpool, where there were factories. So people were there. They were the sanitation is bad, and the workers in the factories were earning money, but they also were suffering because there were no laws on minimum wage, number of hours of work that was reasonable, safety precautions for workers, or the age limit for workers. So men, women, and children were working in unsafe cotton factories, for instance. So there was side by side massive amounts of wealth and massive amounts of suffering. Many, many people suffering very intensely. So the philosophical radicals such as Jeremy Bentham and James Mill is J.S. Mill's father, sought to use philosophy for social reform. So I'm not going to dwell on this a lot in the recording because you can read about this yourself in the lessons that I gave you. So the utilitarian philosophy that Mill inherited from Bentham and his father, James Mill, was focused on preventing suffering from continuing and promoting human happiness. Now, Mill is very interesting in that he inherited the worldview as an Englishman, according to which certain sections of society, the aristocracy, were privileged. And also, he inherited a certain kind of philosophy or perspective from his father and from his father's friend. And this perspective was radically challenging the status quo in their society. But Mill was questioning both the status quo, so of a few people being very happy and a lot of people suffering. So on that point, he was in agreement with his father and with Bentham. And yet Mill was also critical, not entirely inheriting the world picture that he got from his elders, because he was actually modifying the utilitarian perspective that he inherited from them. So Mill is not the one who, quote unquote, invented utilitarianism. The utilitarian theory that we read in him is taken from Bentham and James Mill and others. But Mill was doing something important and different, right? He was not just uncritically accepting everything. So if we go back to that point from Midgley, there's a big problem that can come in two forms. One is uncritically accepting the world pictures that you got from your elders, from your upbringing, socialization, and so on. And that means inheriting past mistakes, getting trapped in the old perspectives. And then the other thing is uncritically rejecting the world picture that you got from your elders, from your socialization. That can be a problem too, not least because it's a knee-jerk reaction. So Mill seems to have found this kind of middle ground where he was taking some elements of the view that inherited from the philosophical radicals and the earlier utilitarians, but he was doing something new himself. So J.S. Mill, the man in this picture, and beside him is Harriet Taylor Mill, a lifelong friend who eventually became his wife. But also Harriet Taylor Mill was a collaborator in philosophizing for J.S. Mill. They wrote certain treatises together, and her influence is very strong in Mill's writings on the status of women. Okay, so a bit of background on J.S. Mill. So first, he is an empiricist. He believed that sense experience is the ultimate source of knowledge. So for those of you who may have backgrounds in philosophy, the debate in the European tradition between the rationalists and the empiricists. The rationalists were people like René Descartes, who thought very highly of mathematics, and they were asking this philosophical question, which is more important? Is it reason? Is it experience? The rationalist answer for prioritization is that reason is more important. The abstract, the rational workings of our mind, what we can derive from that is more important. Mill is the exact opposite. So Mill is an empiricist in that, to the philosophical question, which has greater primacy? Is it reason? Is it experience? Mill takes the answer of it is experience, right? So he believed that sense experience is the ultimate source of knowledge. So that's just a background for his approach. And I think that fits in nicely with consequentialism because the consequence of an action is an empirical matter. It's something that we can observe. It's something that we can measure. To some extent, it's even something we can count, right? So that fits in with his view on knowledge. With regard to association with earlier views, utilitarianism is more similar to Epicureanism. So Epicurus is a figure from ancient Greece, and Epicureanism is against Platonism and other forms of other forms of thought in the ancient world that prioritized philosophizing or thinking over living a good life. So the Epicureanism and utilitarianism subscribes to this, endorses the view that life does not exist for the sake of knowledge. Human beings do not exist in order to philosophize and to reason. Rather, reasoning and philosophizing exists for the sake of promoting a happy life. So this is like philosophy and other domains of inquiry at the service of a good life for human beings, right? So the last point on this slide connects us with the next one. Mill has a complex view of happiness, and it's very, very important we understand that, because failure to understand this point would amount to failure to understand utilitarianism, all of the theory, right? So let's look at what this is about. So the utilitarians want to promote human happiness, and the flip side of that is they want to mitigate and prevent human suffering. But what do we mean by happiness and suffering? Of course, these English words are familiar, but this is like we're taking the philosophical approach, so we are inquiring more closely on into what we mean with these terms. So what do we mean by happiness? What do we mean by happiness? When you read the text after listening to this recording, there's a very famous quote from Mill where he says, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And that's why I have this picture on this slide. He's not looking down on pigs. There's actually no reason to do that. But the idea is that we want proper human happiness. So to the question, what do we mean by happiness? The quick and short answer is Mill is interested in what is properly human happiness, happiness that's suitable for a human being, right? So Bentham thought about happiness in a different way. So Bentham proposed to look at the aggregate amount of pleasure or happiness that's produced by a certain action or by a certain set of social policies. So this is a purely quantitative approach. So according to Bentham, let's just count instantiations of happy feeling. So we can have a person who is happy because her social media post was liked or responded to by her crush. Okay, that's one type of happiness. There is another person who is happy because he just had a good lunch. Masarap ang ulam nila. So that's a one instantiation of a happy feeling. And we can have a third person, or we can have a group of 3 people who are happy because they have reached the point of self-actualization. They have worked so hard in their entire life on an important scientific project and they reached a breakthrough. So for Bentham, it doesn't matter that somebody is smiling because she saw a like on social media, somebody got eat well, maybe got to eat their comfort food for lunch, and then the third person, the third group, 3 people, maybe they were working in a lab or something like that on a big project, they seem to have achieved self-actualization because, let's say, their scientific finding is not just groundbreaking, but has important social implications. Maybe comparable to the discovery of the mRNA vaccine that a lot of people are benefiting from right now. So to Bentham, the quality of the pleasure did not matter. It was just about aggregation, right? So you just look at instances where people were feeling pleasure, and what your goal is just to produce as many instances of happy incidents in all people's lives, in the entire community, in the whole world. That's the goal. Mill disagreed with this. And I think his disagreement on this point may have been influenced by his experience with depression and his realization that happiness is not a simple quantitative matter. So Mill's utilitarianism recognizes the qualitative side of happiness, right? So he is famous for this interesting view that I'm about to discuss, where he talks about lower and higher pleasures. Now, we have to be careful about this because lower pleasures are not bad in themselves, right? We're not saying it's bad to feel happy because you had a good lunch, or it's bad to feel happy because you're getting some kind of attention from somebody you like. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But the idea, to go back to an earlier point, is that that's not sufficient for a properly human happiness over the course of an entire lifetime. The problem with just aggregating amounts of pleasure or happy incidents or happy feelings is that it can turn out to focus on lower happiness, and that would lead to a problem. So lower pleasures need to be satisfied, but satisfying them is not enough for proper human happiness. One way to explain this is to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I bet almost all of you are familiar with this. So we have basic needs, needs connected to the body, food, shelter, clothing, and satisfaction of basically of all bodily functions. It causes extreme pain to be hungry. to be not sheltered properly, to be sick, and so on. So everybody needs a baseline. We get pleasure from eating. We get pleasure from being sheltered and comfortable. We get pleasure from satisfying bodily needs. But if we're just aggregating amounts of pleasure and that's all we're interested in, it's all the lower pleasures, we're missing important targets, is the idea. We have psychological needs of emotional connection and social acceptance, of esteem from our peers, and also of self-actualization. We're also looking at the hierarchy of happiness there. So the qualitative side of happiness also looks at, well, are we satisfying certain other needs of the human being apart from the quick and easy ones connected to the lower types of happiness, right? So again, I want to make this point clear. Lower forms of happiness are not bad. It's just that they're not enough, right? So what the conditions, the general conditions that will allow a pig to live a good life, a good piggy life, is very different from the conditions that will allow a human being, or not just an individual human being, because a human being exists in groups, but a happy society, a happy life. The conditions are very different. So Mill's utilitarianism is interested in promoting what will produce proper human happiness. And he actually goes into his discussion of lower and higher pleasures in a way that goes beyond Maslow's the hierarchy of needs. Mill's idea is that the higher pleasures come from satisfying a greater amount of our capacities, right? So before the pandemic, usually when this is discussed in class, I ask students to compare eating a cake, eating a slice of good chocolate cake, for instance, and comparing that with having good friends. And I qualify that by saying having good friends does not mean having many Facebook friends or many Twitter mutuals. That's not what it means. So if you have a good friend, like your best friend from your youth, or maybe it's a sibling, it's a sister or a brother who's your best friend, right? What's the difference between the happiness that you get from eating cake and the happiness that you get from having a good friend and being a good friend in return? And the comparison is sort of funny, maybe, if when you hear about it. But this kind of comparison is something we can use to explain Mill's point. The happiness that you get from eating a slice of cake has something to do with your taste buds, with your gut, with your preference for food, maybe like sweets and things like that. So there's a certain aspect of you that's satisfied when you are eating a slice of cake, especially if you are hungry or craving exactly that kind of food. But when you are experiencing happiness from having a good friend, that involves more dimension of the person. In fact, being a good friend requires the entire person, your emotions, your thoughts, your affection, your will, and everything, the entire person, right? And there's, of course, physical presence or maybe social presence if we are physical distancing. So Mill thinks that the higher and lower forms of happiness is rooted in the specific kind of pain that human beings experience when they have a capacity that cannot be fulfilled. And we have these capacities for social connection that's satisfied by friendship. We have a capacity for creativity. We have creativity or innovation. We have the capacity for reasoning, right? Or inquiry. So it's a particularly painful existence if a human being can have all the basic needs satisfied, but does not experience interpersonal connection, there are no friends or close family members around, or creativity is stunted because she is maybe doing a job she does not find interesting or meaningful, or maybe it's repetitive, right? So that a proper human a human life that we can say is properly happy, has a happiness suitable to a human being, includes not just the satisfaction of physical needs, but meaningful work, meaningful social connections, and also rest and recreation. You can have meaningful work, but you can be miserable also because it takes a toll on your ability to be with people you love and take care of your own physical and mental well-being. So Mill is kind of more ambitious, he's actually more ambitious than the earlier utilitarians, because he talks about the aggregation, like producing the greatest happiness of the greatest number. But by happiness, he means to include the qualitative side, exactly the higher and lower forms of happiness that I was just talking about. So from here, we go to the greatest happiness principle, which is the core of utilitarianism. This is like the root of everything, is the foundational idea. And it's very easy to state, right? So, and it's actually a formula. An act is right if and only if it promotes the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Okay. Now I want you to notice something very important. It doesn't say the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people, right? So the aggregation or the counting is not counting of heads. It's not counting of people, but it's counting of experiences or instantiations of happiness. And this has implications for the entire system, right? So if we can give a crude example, if we have a society where we have a certain person who, let's say, has 10 units of happiness, right? Well, we'll set aside how we counted that, but let's say she has 10 units of happiness because she has all her basic needs satisfied, and she also has resources to satisfy or to provide her with certain forms of luxury. But around her, there are people who don't have their basic needs satisfied, right? They don't have enough to eat. They don't have a proper home, etc. They don't have access to clean drinking water, right? So a lot of things going on there. Now, if we take this person who has 10 units of happiness, and maybe we can have another person in the same community who has maybe -4, is experiencing pain because of lack of access to clean drinking water and absence of food and proper shelter. If we reduce the units of happiness for our person who has everything, all the basic needs satisfied, plus some luxuries, so we take away something from her, maybe we take away most of her luxuries, or some of her luxuries, all her basic needs are still satisfied, right? So if she has 8 units of happiness, she can go down to 7 or 6, right? So remember, she doesn't go to the point of pain because she still has the basic needs plus the opportunities that she needs to attain or work towards self-actualization. But if we get that 2 units taken from that person, from the resources, and we give it to the person who's satisfying, who is not satisfied at all and who is suffering, we get a bigger increase in happiness for the total system, not for the individual. So somebody who is at -4, give them clean drinking water, food, shelter, that will produce tremendous relief. And probably you take away 1 or 2 points from the person who's well off, and you use those resources to give to the people who are not able to access basic needs. And then probably the person at -4 now moves up to +2 or +4 even. So that means a greater increase of happiness in the system. I'm just illustrating how utilitarians think, right? So it's calculative, it's aggregating, but it's not a simple and crude counting of heads. That's a very important point to recognize. So the greatest happiness principle provides us with a definition of right action. Right action is the action available to the agent that will promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So we actually have like a definition, right, derivable from the formula that we began with, right? Now, to speak more about the idea, right? So remember, I was talking about eating slices of cake, and I was talking about eating a slice of cake in the earlier example. And I was talking about taking away some units of happiness for somebody who's basically living a comfortable life and taking those resources to help somebody who is experiencing intense suffering. This fits with certain ideas in economics, right? Because we know, for instance, the laws of diminishing returns. So compare the happiness that you get from eating the first slice of cake to the second slice, to the third slice, to the 10th slice. The 10th slice probably produces pain instead of producing more happiness. So this logic, if you like, of producing happiness is indexed on human experience. And it's not just adding and adding and adding stuff or opportunities or things like that and arriving at the conclusion that, okay, if you give more slices of cake, that means more happiness. It's not exactly like that, right? So this pushes utilitarians to adopt an egalitarian view. So for them, the main thing is to create general conditions that are equally to everyone's advantage. So the GHP is egalitarian. The utilitarians have this slogan: everyone's happiness matters and everyone's happiness matters equally, right? Because that's the only way that we can promote more proper human happiness, right? More of the proper human happiness for more people. So utilitarians recognize that only focusing on the majority sets a bad precedent, and it in fact produces bad long-term consequences to mistreat minority groups. Any community or society or even a small unit like a family will experience instability, friction, and a lot of other problems if there's one member that's not being treated fairly, that's not being given access to opportunity or given an equal or fair share of resources. So the utilitarians recognize this. Often the theory is caricatured to care only about pleasing the majority, but the view is more nuanced than that. So Mill thinks that guaranteeing basic freedoms allows for reflective self-rule and self-realization. So the idea is you can't force people to attain self-actualization, but you create certain basic conditions that allow them to make decisions for themselves. So they have the basic rights, the basic privileges in a well-functioning society, and they can pursue their own happiness themselves. So that's a basic view of the utilitarians. I'm going to end here for this part of the lesson, and your next task is to read the Mill text so that you can get a sense of how a utilitarian thinks. The text is from the 19th century, so some of the English sentences might be challenging at certain parts, but I think it's not so hard to read. Be informed that the text is written in objection and reply format. So Mill says, some people think this, or some people raise this objection, and this is how I reply. So make sure to pay attention to what objections he's explaining, and then how he's addressing those objections.